This is the most important finance video I will make all year. Seriously. Sorry, I'll try and not get my hands too close to the lens again. It has a tendency to make my hands look massive for some reason. But anyway, check this out. The ONS put together a document that looked at individual wealth. They wanted to know, where does everyone keep their money, richest to poorest. On average, respondents in the richest decile held 50% of their wealth in pensions and 32% in property. Your pension will be the most valuable thing that you ever own, which makes the findings of this report even more concerning. 75% of people of all ages couldn't accurately say what was inside their pension. This apathy towards what will be the biggest pot of cash you ever control is costing you hundreds a year. Of the 43 billion that will be invested each year from 2019 onwards into pensions, around 9 billion or £700 per employee will be wasted. Madness, isn't it? Today, we're going to fix all of that. But where do we start? Here. Can you see that? Kind of looks like a crop circle, doesn't it? It's a place called Sun City in Arizona. Do you know the term golden years? Yeah. Well, it was invented in 1959 by a guy called Del Webb to sell this place. Before 1959, people didn't like the idea of retiring. Advancements in medicine meant many people were living longer, and they just didn't know what to do with all that extra time. Too old to work, too young to die, as Walter Reuther put it. People who are retired now, many of them are older than the modern accepted vision of what a Western retirement should be. So good was the slogan Golden Years. It landed Del on the cover of Time magazine, made him silly amounts of cash, and was so enduring it changed the way we all think about retirement forever. The slogan stuck, but the way we pay for retirement has been changing constantly. We've gone from relying on state pension to banking on generous company pensions.
That's who pays their pensions.
To now in 2024, really, it's on you to pay for this golden dream. The problem with that is, left to our own devices, we are really bad at planning for our long-term futures. This became very apparent in the early 2000s when the UK government observed that less than half of people were investing into their company pensions. So they stepped in, and with a simple shift, they changed everything. In 2012, they said instead of opting into your pension, you now have to opt out. It's been a great success.
Great success.
Over 10 million people now pay into work-based schemes, but the success of this scheme is its ultimate downfall. 8.5 million of the 11 million people who are saving every month into these work-based pensions just take the default option. They accept what the pension provider says is the standard investment choice. But then that creates a question. How can a pension provider provide one fund that caters to millions of people all at once with different needs? The answer is they create a one-size-fits-all option that doesn't actually fit anyone properly. Default funds by design tend to lean towards being cautious. The red line here shows the overall risk of default funds. The blue line shows the overall risk people take when they're asked what they actually want. It might look small, but this impact in terms of how much money you end up with is massive. The paper which looks at this I've linked below, but they took an employee earning 22k a year, paying a total of 8% of their income into a pension, and then they produced results under 3 different sets of circumstances. Using the performance of an average default fund, a fund that's 20% less risky, and then an option that's 20% more risky than the default. Then they worked out based on the market performing really bad, really well, and average over a 30-year time period. Notice how in the bad case, the figures are basically the same. Yes, the high risk option did perform the worst here. But in the average return and the bull case, the most risky option produces significantly better results. £15,000 a year of retirement income better in the best case scenario here. I hope now it's clear why this is so important. So take my perfectly normal sized hands and let's go through this together step by step. First step, let's just cover the rules around auto-enrollment so you know what you're entitled to. If you're part-time or full-time employed, it doesn't matter. You will be enrolled into a work-based scheme if you meet the following criteria that are on screen at the minute. If you earn less than 10k but more than 6,240, your employer doesn't have to enroll you into the scheme, but you can ask to be part of it and they can't refuse you. In terms of what you pay in, you may have heard people say that you pay in 4%, the government gives you 1% tax relief, and then your employer pays 3%. These are the basic requirements, but we actually need to consider what's called qualifying earnings. This 4%, 1% tax relief and 3% rule applies to any income between £6,240 and the higher limit of £50,270. So if your income is below 5270, the percentage is applied to your salary minus the 6240. So if you earn a salary of £25,000, these percentages just apply to £18,760 worth of income. These are the minimum requirements an employer must stick to. They don't need to do anything more than that. Of course, some will. Some will pay on your whole salary, some will allow for contributions on higher than the basic income. It's important that you understand what your employer offers so you can maximise the reward. This is a big perk of a job at the end of the day, and it could be the deciding factor between working for one company or another. The questions I want you to ask your employer are: is the work-based scheme only on qualifying earnings, or is it on whole salary? And what percentage of my salary will you match? Once you know what they match, use this calculator that I've linked below to work out what you will be getting and decide if you want to pay more in. Personally, I'm looking to take full advantage of the maximum they would match. You could then also consider if you want to pay more in of your wages to reduce your overall tax liability, especially if you're in some of the higher tax bands, because it's quite efficient to pay extra in. But today's focus is all about the default funds. So the next step is getting inside the pension itself by asking your employer, who is the pension with?
Retirement plans, pension funds, all in one package.
Just for a second, imagine I said to you, I'm going to give you 11 million customers. They will pay you hundreds a year into your service. Most of them won't even know who you are, where that money's going. In fact, most of them will never even log on at all to take a look. What are you going to do with their money then? We need to know what's going on inside of our pensions. I'm not saying there's anything nefarious going on here. These are heavily regulated businesses, but they are businesses after all, so they're in it to make money. And I just question, who benefits the most out of the default fund arrangement that's going on at the minute? I found a load of things that I personally don't like when looking at these. There's actually quite a few providers. Here are some of the main ones. Unfortunately, they're not all as good as each other. Sometimes they have fewer options. There's others that charge fees higher than the others as well. I think there should be standardisation personally across fees across all of these providers. They do have a cap on fees for smaller pensions, but we're talking if you have less than £100 with them. After that, it's the Wild West. Jeremy Hunt recently announced plans for a pot for life pension system. This might mean some sort of standardisation of fees is implemented, but in a second I'll give you an example of some of the more unpalatable fees that I found. I have put together as well a full overview of everything we discussed today as a newsletter. It includes the questions for your employer, a table of the main providers, including their fees, contact details, and any other important information I think you need to know about them. I've also put together a fund overview document that we'll go through in a minute that will help you just decipher all of the fund options that are available. But to give you an example, Nest are one of the largest providers, mainly because it's free for employers to use them. They do charge the user though, us, the employee, a fairly reasonable 0.3% fund fee. Nest has around 30 billion in assets under management as of 2019, so just their 0.3% fund fee is getting them about 90 million a year in fees and growing. But they also charge 1.8% on any money that's paid into their service, and they call this a contribution charge. I hate these types of fees. I think they're predatory, and any argument that it's to cover administration costs is just a load of bollocks, really. They have around 390 employees listed on LinkedIn. Surely that 100 million a year is enough to cover the costs of running this organisation without the 1.8% contribution fee. This is just an example, and they might still be cheaper than some of the other platforms. The People's Pension, another big one, charges about 0.5% for their funds, which means that they are probably more expensive on larger portfolios, even considering the contribution charge. It's just an example of the non-standardisation of fees across all of these providers that really leave people in the dark on kind of how much they're paying versus other providers in the market. Don't let the fees put you off though, because at the end of the day, you're still getting the employer match, which more than makes up for the fees. But use the document link below, as I said, to get an overview of the fees of the main providers, especially the one that you're using. If I've missed a provider off, let me know and I'll add them onto the list. The next thing is the most important thing, and that's choosing a fund. I can't tell you what fund to buy, that's your choice. All I want you to do though is make it your choice. As I go through this, I'll tell you what I'm looking at and what I'd be looking for, so you can get an idea of how I would approach this. We know the default funds are broad, one size fits all, and that they tend to lean to being more conservative. But coming back to Nest, over 99% of people using Nest are in these retirement date funds, which is their default option. This style of investing is often known as lifestyling, and the idea is that when you're younger, the fund is more aggressive or more risky, and as you approach retirement, they de-risk your portfolio, taking you out of riskier investments like the stock market and into more safe ones that have less potential for growth, but also less potential to decline in value suddenly. Sounds great on paper. Nest claims that this is what people want and that they've conducted surveys. I had a Nest pension when I was working full time. No one ever asked me about that. If we look at their 2040 fund, so this is a fund for people retiring in 2040, so about 15 years away. I would personally say that that's a long time before retirement. You know, a whole 15 years of working before I'm retiring. I ain't done yet, Nest. But we can see that the fund has large allocations to bonds already, and it has essentially de-risked. And we can also see this reflected in the performance. In the last 12 months, it gave about an 8% return, whereas the S&P 500 over that time period delivered 25%, and global markets gave you about 15% over the same time period. Even more worrying is at the start, when you're in your 20s, if you're in one of these funds, they have what's called a foundation period for 5 years, which again looks to dampen the chances of major drops in the portfolio by reducing risk and, of course, by reducing potential returns. So in a 40-year investing timeline, Nest are tapping the brakes for half of it. This bit in the 20s to me is worrying, as that's the exact point in your investing journey you should be taking the most risk, as you have the most time to recover. I can see why people might want to reduce volatility in a portfolio as they approach retirement. But as I am now, I want as much exposure to the stock market as possible. And when I'm 15 years from retirement, I honestly can't see that changing. I personally don't like these target date funds for my own goals, as they seem to be trimming exposure to equity very early. Again, that's just my own personal preference, but if you don't know what you're buying, you can't even have that conversation with you. And Nest here is making decisions with their clients' money that will impact how much they have at the end. If you're unsure on how to approach this, I think the things that you need to consider first of all are, what's your risk appetite? If you're unsure, below is a test that you can take from Standard Life that might help you frame this and get an understanding of, how much risk you're willing to take. You can then filter out funds based on this risk preference. On the People's Pension, you'll see that they have 3 risk profiles. Balanced is their default option. Again, this is another example of this middle one-size-fits-all. I personally would be filtering out to the adventurous, so the default fund for me here is too cautious. Also, you need to ask yourself, do you have any specific requirements in terms of investing preference? Are you looking to be green or ethical or anything like this? Also, don't be scared to jump on a call with your pension provider and ask them what funds meet my requirements. They work for you at the end of the day, make them earn their fees. Every fund on every platform has to have what's called a fact sheet to show you what it does. This one on screen is from the People's Pension. I'll give you a rundown of what I'm looking at here so you can see some of the things that I consider when assessing this fund. Also, in the newsletter, I've gone through every fund on all of the major providers and just given you my high-level thoughts on what I think of each fund. I've excluded any bond-only funds and ones that are aimed for people post-retirement. With this People's Pensions Fund, the objective, it mentions that it's a higher risk fund that aims to achieve long-term growth by primarily investing across the UK and overseas equity markets. One thing I think instantly here is this is a global fund, but they mention the UK first. If we scroll down and look at the international weighting, you can see that the UK market in this fund makes up 8% of the fund. But the UK on a global standing is only actually about 4% of the global stock market. So this fund is leaning towards the UK. That's not a huge thing, but when you consider also that the USA market is 65% of the global stock market, this fund is not reflecting the global market very closely. What this fund is actually doing is saying, this is our version of the world. Fees here are 0.5% or 0.5%, which is on the pricey side for a global index, but all of these pension providers honestly seem to be taking the piss when it comes to fees. Another thing I want to look at is the performance versus the benchmark. A benchmark is just the fund's target, so it's them saying we want to keep pace or beat this thing. Think of it like a ghost car on Gran Turismo when you're racing. Under fund facts, it says the benchmark is the UK CPI plus 3%. That means that they want to beat the UK's measure for inflation by 3% a year. This is a common goal across many of the providers. Nest was the same. They've done a shocking job of this in the last 5 years. But as this is an inflation benchmark and inflation went a little bit crazy, maybe we can cut them some slack here. In this case, I think the fund is expensive and the allocations are a bit off in terms of a global standing. but I would take this over the default fund, which was far too cautious for me. Options are limited with most of these platforms, and really it's about picking the best fund from the lot. We could go further here as well and start talking about transfers, partial transfers, consolidation of existing pensions, but I think the default fund point here is the first fight we need to fight together. Go into work tomorrow, find out the features and benefits of the scheme at work so that you can maximise the value that your employer offers you. Understand who the provider is, so then you can figure out what they're charging you. Log on to the platform and see what funds are available and what fund you're in already, and just see if there's something that might suit you better, that's more in line with your risk profile and your overall investment goals. Everything you need, I hope, is in the document below. I really do hope that that helps, and I also hope that you feel inspired to take control of what will be the most valuable thing that you probably ever own. Please understand this isn't investment advice. I'm not a qualified advisor who knows your circumstances. I'm just a random dude on the internet trying to lend you a perfectly normal sized hand.